So the problems in the field, or the gaps in the research that I saw was when I'm in Honduras, or you're currently in Honduras, it's assumed that having English language speaking skills, but reading and writing too, will automatically lead to a better life. This is like an unquestioned narrative that is happening in society with nearly everybody. And this includes teachers, it includes North Americans, it includes Hondurans. I started, once I was living there, I started to question that a little bit. So for example, I'll just give an anecdote. This guy named Tonio, who was about 23 years old, got deported to the neighborhood where I was living, and everybody said, oh, Tonio's getting deported, he's in detention, he's getting deported next week. Oh, but Tonio's been in the United States for 15 years, he speaks perfect English, like this is going to be easy for him to find a job. He'll just go to the airport, he'll just do something in tourism, he can go to a call center, he can get a job. So he comes back, no one has seen him since he's been little. Antonio has tattoos on his knuckles, and he doesn't know how to use a computer. So he starts applying for jobs because he speaks English like I do. At the airport, he can't get a job because of the tattoos. At the call centers, he can't get a job because he doesn't know how to use a computer. And so it wasn't that he spoke English, right? Everybody says, as long as you speak English, but no, it's like highly mediated by, your race, your gender, your geography, where you've been living, your education level, who you know, and then down to if you have tattoos or not. And so everybody just kind of automatically assumes like, oh, if I just fill my head up with English, or if I just fill your head up with English, you will have a better life. That's not always the case. English as a language subject, and I'm saying this because there's a lot of schools in Honduras that, like I taught in an English-speaking school where we did math and we did art and we had all the subjects. Most of these English centers or English language schools are English. The language is the education. So there's no math, there's no science. It's just like you are learning English so that you can go have a better life or whatever. And so people were kind of debating, well, does that support Honduras getting better, or is that something that's undermining like real critical education that maybe would be something for change? The research on international teaching wholeheartedly agrees, and I agree as well, that an international teaching experience leads to the North American individual teacher's growth and contributes to local human capital. I have no doubt that this is true. I am positive that anyone who goes and teaches abroad comes back multicultural, maybe bilingual, lots of flexibility. There's no doubt in my mind that that is true. I don't also, I bet it's also true that the students that they educate also have maybe more access, they understand maybe North American relations, etc. But the thing that's left out of the research is always what's going on at that neighbor school, what's going on at the public school next door, what's going on with the public school teachers who they think their jobs are being undermined because all of these North Americans are coming in and doing schooling and stuff. And so that's kind of something that's left out of the research, which Mohanty reminds me, the global and the local, and the local and the local. And then also English education centers on economic opportunity. So there's the term human capital, which is used in a lot of the research, like, oh, if we can teach these kids English, they can contribute to their country's human capital, they can make money, they can turn Honduras around, I guess, and make it a global superpower, economic superpower. And of course, Paulo Freire would say that if that's the aim of education, it's never going to work. It neglects whatever political and ideological implications that English as the education, not even as the language of education, but as education might have. So that was what I kind of came to my dissertation knowing. I did a qualitative study using ethnographic methods. The majority of my data set is interviews and observations. Although, while I was there, I realized really quickly that everything was data. Every time I turned around, someone was like, oh, you're the gringo from the United States. Will you teach me English so I can get a job? I mean, this was happening all the time. I was given handouts, I was invited to speak, I was, just constant. I have a huge tub at home of pamphlets that I was given and, everything that you can imagine. But for my dissertation, I'm limiting it to interviews and observations. And then the idea is I'm situating what those people are saying in the global and local context which I observed. And so, again, I was trying to figure out okay, this is what's happening at this bilingual or English-speaking school, but what's happening with the neighbors? What's happening with the public school? And so whatever they were saying, I was situating it into those contexts. And then to analyze the data, I used critical discourse analysis, Fairclough and G. I love G's 7 building blocks of language, but to talk about all 7 of them I feel was too much, and I really like significance. So a lot of times I'm looking at what the teachers are saying and what they're giving significance to and what they're taking significance away from. So for example, they might be talking about, oh yeah, these kids need to have English language because it will get them a better job. They're giving significance to English language without really any proof to back it up, etc. So that's how, what my methods work. My findings are that number one, language, which is probably not a big surprise to anyone here, including language as education is closely connected to identity and culture. And so there were a lot of people who were critical of this English language in Honduras, or even North American teachers in Honduras. Hondurans were critical of this because they felt like it was undermining their identity and their culture. They'll be the first ones to say, like, I get that we speak Spanish, which is the language of the colonizers, but we're also, like, you know, trying to be our own thing, and when people come and teach us English, and in a North American style education, it's problematic. And in one example that a professor gave me at the teaching university, he said that in Honduras, the public schools go from February to November, okay? So their break is like November, December, and January. But because of the proliferation of private or, you know, uncertified English language centers run by North Americans or people with connections to the United States, a lot of them are changing their schedules to September to May, like a US schedule. And he said that Christmas has never in the history of Honduras been celebrated during the school year. And now all of a sudden, like, thousands and thousands of kids are celebrating Christmas within their school year, where there used to be no one would ever in their right mind have a Christmas tree. Everybody wants a Christmas tree because the curriculum has Christmas trees. And so he was saying, like, there's been a real big culture shift in the last few decades because of that education. So it's not simply like, oh, teaching English or not teaching English. It's also like kind of this cultural shift. And he also noted, he showed me a textbook that had like apple trees to count and stuff. And he said, we don't even have apple trees under. It's like, why is this not a mango tree or something? And so he said that, you know, not that like one identity is better or worse than the other, but there is really like a preference for North American education, and what is that doing to Honduran culture? Number two, in the transnational setting, the ability to speak English was regarded as 1,000 times more important than teacher preparation, content learning, knowledge of local culture, or any ideas to the contrary were considered backwards. So for example, I ran into an Australian teacher who had like dropped out of high school and was just backpacking around, hanging out, and they were like, hey, you speak English, you want to have a job? And so they gave him like a teaching job, and he said, like, I don't know, they just hire us, we're totally riffs and strays, I can't believe they give us all of this power in their community. And I'm kind of like, me neither, because you have no teaching background. And of course the public school teachers are like, yeah, like we're actually trained in teaching, and we know Honduran culture, and we know like what books to use, and we can't get a job, but like some random backpacker comes by and they're like, hey, you should have a job here, we'll pay you and you can live here for free. So that was more important than teacher preparation, than content learning, as I mentioned, like math or whatever is a lot of times left out of these English language centers, and knowledge of local culture, or even like being cognizant of what it would mean to speak English. So for example, I went to a bilingual school. It was so far remote. I have a motorcycle in Honduras, and I had to like ford a river with my motorcycle to get to the school. And I showed up, and there was a group of North Americans from Pennsylvania there, and they were running this school. There were like 70 little kids, and they all were like perfectly bilingual. They spoke perfect English. And I get there, so I'm not judging like whether their pedagogy is good. I'm sure it is, because these kids were speaking pretty good English. But like the knowledge of the local culture, like they were so far remote. The idea is that they're going to have a better life because they speak English. What are you going to be using English for at this like remote village? It's forcing you to migrate to an urban center to use it, and then all of a sudden you're caught up in this thing where you like are paying rent and looking for a job and whatever. So you've got self-sustaining farmers, or I mean, I'm not saying they aren't, you know, poor or in poverty, but they're somewhat self-sufficient, and then all of a sudden now they have this English, which is going to give them human capital, and everybody thinks they should go to the city, and it kind of creates this, you know, weird cycle that like didn't exist until this school came down there. So anyway, the local North American teachers didn't seem to really understand that dynamic or what that would mean, and often they don't speak Spanish, so they wouldn't be privy to like it if people would bring it up. And then the fact that English equals access or leads to access is an absolute myth. It's definitely not English. It's English if you don't have any tattoos and if you know, 60 other things. So what does this mean for teacher preparation? First of all, I think that teaching in cross-cultural settings is not simply pedagogical. It's not simply just about teaching English. Like I said, I think that a lot of the teachers are pretty good. Like the kids come out of there being bilingual. That's great. But there's real serious political and ideological options or implications, and this is even true in the United States, obviously. if the teaching force in the United States is 80% white women, that's not the demographic of the United States, so there's a lot of teachers teaching in kind of cross-cultural settings. And I think that you need to tread carefully in that. Like, you're not just there to teach, you're also there as this political and ideological person, and you need to be aware of that and deal with it actively. Number two, knowledge of students' context, their families, communities, regions, nations, culture is completely central to a critical education. And whatever you're teaching must reflect that knowledge. So for example, I had a lot of North American teachers that would be, I'd say, do you teach any Honduran